So here's just a quick review of the goals for today's Echo session. I won't go through them because Anna just did, but really excited just to be able to talk with you and to be able to be open about all of this, because I think it's a topic that is extremely important and affects all areas of our work. I'd like to start off by orienting us to the ecological systems theory, or EST model, which our team used as a guide and inspiration for developing this ECHO series. It's one of the main frameworks used in developmental psychology and was developed by Russian-born American psychologist Uri Bronfenbrenner in the 1970s. EST gets at the idea that there's a complex system of interactions at play between multiple levels of environments and social networks that children develop within. There are 5 different systems, 4 of which are reflected here, and how they interlock together to show just how much influence one has on the other. They're organized by order of impact. So basically, the closer the level to the child, or the closer the system to the child, the more weight it can have, whether negative or positively, on child outcomes. I really appreciate and want to bring attention to the core of the individual in this model as we talk about
Ellie,
mental. Yeah.
Your slide is not advancing.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Is that better?
Looks great. Yep.
Okay, it'll be smaller, but it's all right. Yeah, so this is the EST model. Let's look at the core of the individual. So when we talk about mental health, I really want to get at the idea that a child's identity, their gender, age, their ableism, their physical health, they all play a huge role in how they interact with and benefit from each of these systems. The first system is the microsystem, and that's the most intimate, those who have direct contact with the child. That's the family, friends, siblings, teachers. It's really the critical shell for supporting the child's healthy development. So let's think of the impact of the microsystem on mental health. What if the child has a parent with a substance use disorder? That can negatively affect emotional behavioral patterns that the children operates from, what coping skills they may use. And then on the other hand, the power of one positive connection with an adult can positively impact their development. And that's why it's so important for us as educators, teachers, psychologists, counselors to have conversations about children's mental health with them. And, we're really impacting them every day by the presence we have in their lives. And that level of responsibility shouldn't intimidate us, it should empower us. Next up is the mesosystem. And this is the system about interactions and connections between those in the child's microsystem. So that means interactions between parents and teachers, interactions between siblings and parents, or, if that's a teenager, maybe that teenager's romantic partner and their parents. So let's think about a time when you noticed a student of yours observing how you treat another student, or how a parent-teacher conference can shift the course of that relationship that you have with that student. Kids are observant and they're curious. They attune emotionally to relationships around them from a very young age. And those patterns can persist for years. Then we have the exosystem, and this really encompasses formal and informal social structures, those that indirectly influence the child since they affect others in the child's life. So an example of this would be thinking of a child whose parent got let go from their job. What if that father has then taken on so much stress that he takes that frustration out on his child and abuses him or her? That leads to, a traumatic potential response from that child for being abused and neglected. And depending on other positive people in that child's life, that could develop into a mental health disorder if left untreated. Then we have the macrosystem. And this is all about the established society and culture that a child develops in. Those elements can be their SES status, ethnicity, race, gender, really anything that can influence the beliefs and perceptions about life. A child grown up in a wealthy family may have different opportunities than a child who's impoverished. And that can definitely lead to different mental health outcomes. Then the last system that's not reflected in this particular picture of the model, but is also important to mention, is the chronosystem. Chrono meaning time, right? So this accounts for the environmental changes that occur over a child's lifetime. And that can be major life transitions that are normal, like going to kindergarten for the first time or heading off to college. Also historical events like war or the pandemic, for instance, right? And thinking about all the implications that we might not know yet that will inevitably impact child development. This can also mean an unexpected death of a parent or caregiver, or a parent's divorce. So let's continue to use EST to connect some dots about mental illness by looking at how it impacts US youth at the individual, community, and society levels. 16.5% of US youth aged 6 to 17 experienced a mental health disorder in 2016. That's 7.7 million kids. And of those kids, only 50.6% received treatment that same year for their mental health disorder. So then we shift to community. And what does lack of individual mental health services and awareness do to our communities? Kids are more likely to drop out of high school if they have significant symptoms of depression compared to healthier peers. Also, over 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system has a mental illness diagnosis. And this is highly concerning and should make us wonder, are these mental disorders influencing their behaviors? If we hadn't stopped and kind of remediated those behaviors before, would that prevented them from maybe engaging in illegal actions? And then what happens after they get out of the system and become adults? So really thinking about how we can prevent kids from getting involved with the justice system in the first place. And then we look at the biggest picture, which is the societal level. Mood disorders are the most common cause of hospitalization for all people in the US under age 45, and that's excluding hospitalization related to pregnancy and birth. Depression and anxiety disorders cost the global economy $1 trillion in lost productivity each year, and depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. One thing I really want to stress with these slides is that these numbers are not getting better, they're rising. Every year. The incidence of mental health disorders in the US has been increasing over the decades as well. Now that I've mentioned both mental illness and mental health, I want to define these for our group and kind of ground us in these two terms. Mental health is emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So it's about satisfaction of life. It's positive individual functioning, autonomy with ourselves. It's also about being of social value to others, feeling accepted, and also contributing to our community. It's how we think, it's what we feel, how we relate to others. The state of our mental health impacts how we respond to and handle stressful situations and what choices we make. Mental health is important from the very moment we are born, from infancy through childhood, adolescence, and towards adulthood, all the way until we're part of the elderly population. And believe it or not, there's a sub area in my field called infant mental health. It's about how young babies experience, regulate, and express emotions and the parents' role in that. So, really mental health is something to build skills for throughout our lifetime. And it's also something that we have the responsibility to look after. And thinking about this, everyone has mental health, but not everyone will experience a mental illness. A mental illness is a condition that affects your mental health. It disrupts your mental state. It interrupts how you feel, think, communicate, and behave. A multitude of factors can contribute to developing a mental illness. Like I said, affects our mood, behavior, our levels of functioning in relationships, personal, romantic ones at school or work. It also can affect the ability to take care of ourselves. Mental illness can be chronic, long-lasting, or occasional, and it can range in severity of symptoms. And it looks different. It can look different for each person. This is the mental health continuum model. This is a really powerful model because it affirms that mental health can and does change over time. It ebbs and flows, and everyone has a place on this continuum. So in reflecting on your own mental health journey, it may be that you found yourself on different areas of the continuum throughout your life. I certainly have. Mental illnesses are the most common health condition in the US, one of the most common. More than 50% of people will be diagnosed with a mental illness or disorder at some point in their lifetime. And I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this to stress exactly the complete opposite truth. Anyone who is healthy can happen upon a time in their life when they may be in that reacting phase, in that yellow, where they may want to isolate more, or they don't have as much success with meditation because their thoughts are so scattered, or they maybe experience just a feeling of sadness for no particular reason at all. So anyone who is healthy can be in that stage. And on the flip side, anyone who may have a tendency to be in that injured or ill state or has been diagnosed with a clinical disorder, has the ability to feel and stay healthy if they put the right coping mechanisms in place and learn to manage their illness or some of those more severe symptoms. So at the end of the day, and mental illness is not a fixed trait of a person. It's one aspect of them. So when thinking of students, perhaps instead of describing a child as an anxious student, just as we in school psych world, instead of saying someone is an autistic student, we say that student has autism. And so we can shift this from that child is an anxious student to an individual first language where we say he or she is a student with anxiety. And that's one part of them, but that doesn't make up their whole person. So let's take this idea of the continuum model a step further and look at how mental health and mental illness intersect. Although the terms are often used interchangeably, even in different studies that I've read and in different books, right? Having poor mental health and having a mental illness are not the same thing. There is such thing as a presence and absence of mental health, just as there is such thing as the presence and absence of mental illness. So in other words, health is more than the absence of illness. So just to take that a step further, a person can experience poor mental health and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. Likewise, a person diagnosed with a mental illness can still experience periods of physical, mental, or social well-being. So just because someone may be managing a mental illness doesn't mean that they can't simultaneously have a good sense of mental health and still be a functioning, well-rounded person. So looking at this model more in depth, languishing is in that lower left quadrant. And that's that lowest level of functioning where a person really feels no sense of autonomy or social support and also has significant mental health struggles or potentially a mental illness. On the other hand, flourishing, which is the top right quadrant, is the ideal state of functioning where a person experiences happiness with no mental illness. So let's think of a tree whose roots are deeply planted in the ground. When a big rainstorm comes, the tree can weather that, all of that hail and rain and thunder, lightning with resilience. And this is how we can think of mental health. Studies show that individuals who are flourishing and then have an episode of mental illness still function better than those with just moderate mental health with no evidence of mental illness. And that's a pretty amazing idea and finding because it's really about the idea that promoting strong mental health and flourishing in students, by doing that, we're preparing them to better handle mental health struggles should they ever come their way. This is another lovely model because I love models and we love models in psychology. It's called the Psychosocial model, and it illustrates the multitude of factors that contribute to mental health and how they all link together and that they're all interrelated. Research shows that a mental health condition isn't just the consequence of one event. It's about our genetics. So what our parents passed down to us, what our basic brain structure is, the environment we grew up in, and our lifestyle choices too. I like to look at this model to conceptualize risk and protective factors too, as virtually all of these examples could go in a positive or negative direction. So let's think about this. Perhaps a female student hits puberty early, and that's a biological factor. And it's also a risk factor for depression in her life. Yet she maintains a high self-esteem and has a strong psychological well-being. So that's a protective factor. And that's an example of how a risk factor could be potentially mediated by the presence of that protection. It's important to note that 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses develop by age 14, and 75% develop by age 24. So to me, that makes it all the more important for me as a school psychologist to have the most detailed and accurate snapshot I can of a child's life, all of these areas, their genetics, their physical well-being, psychology, so how they think about themselves, what their temperament is, what their personality is, where they grew up, what kind of culture they bring in, what are their family circumstances, was there trauma, all of that, so I can help to prevent or intervene if any of these present as a big risk factor, and also to build upon protective factors that are already in the child's life. Mental and physical health are equal. We have to take care of both. Your mental health is just as important as your physical health. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about because our body and our mind are connected. Mental illness, especially depression, increases the risk for a lot of physical health problems, especially long-lasting diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease, which are some of the leading causes of death for adults in the US. And this relationship is also bidirectional. So if you have a chronic physical condition, it can also increase the risk of developing a mental illness. And I don't know if anyone has heard of the phrase completing the stress cycle, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And it's really another important point I want to make. engaging in physical activity, dancing around your classroom, even hugging someone, all of these physical actions can help our minds to complete the stress cycle that we're experiencing. And if you want to learn more about that, there's an awesome book called Burnout by Amelia and Emily Nagoski that really gets at the idea of how stress and stressors are different in our lives and what we can do to help complete the cycle so our bodies can return back to homeostasis and we can also have a better sense of mental health. Here is some data on what kids have clinically been diagnosed with from the CDC. So ADHD, behavior problems, anxiety, and depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children aged 3 to 17. As you'll see, looking at this bar graph, depression and anxiety diagnoses are more common in older kids, so in that 12 to 17 year old range, whereas behavior problems peak in ages 6 through 11. And that makes sense, right? Because students who may not have a strong of attention or be really hyperactive, that tends to kind of play out whenever they come to enter kindergarten. There's a lot more structure in place for them to kind of rub up against, right? Depression and anxiety are increasing over time for children and adolescents. So for example, in 2003, the rates of anxiety and depression in kids were 5.4%. And then in 2000, flash forward, 8 years, to 2012, that jumped to 8.4%. So, and this is still on that upward trajectory, which is not a good one. So this is the representation of kids in the US that have been officially diagnosed. But what about the ones that don't quite meet the criteria or don't have access to a professional to get a proper diagnosis that could open up windows for treatment? This is where it's so important for us to understand that symptoms and behaviors exist on that continuum. And kids who aren't represented by this graph still need our support, probably more than ever, because they're not getting it from anywhere else. So our SEL curriculums, the extracurricular activities that we provide students to be able to be active and be able to make social connections, having positive connections with teachers, this is how we can let these kids who are on that kind of continuum have a chance to thrive as well. So this is an overwhelming list of what mental illness can present like in the classroom. And I'm not going to read all of these out, but I want to stress a few things to all of us. As educators, as teachers, whatever your role may be in a school, you are not expected to diagnose mental illnesses or provide therapy, right? Unless you're licensed to do so. However, all of us can be aware of signs and changes of behaviors that could be signals to us about our students' declining mental health. And, with all of these, some kids may show this behavior all the time. So, just because a kid's disposition is naturally quiet doesn't mean that they might be struggling with the mental illness. That's not what I'm saying at all. That's why it's really important to stress changes in behavior and really be mindful about observing our children in our classrooms and in the halls. So a couple ones that I do want to pull out. I think an important one is expressing disturbing thoughts and feelings through art and journaling. I think those more creative, expressive modes in classrooms are so important. But by using those in our classroom, we also have a responsibility to reflect on those and to notice any troubling things that we might be seeing, whether they're writing about, a traumatic situation at home or abuse or neglect, or perhaps wanting to hurt themselves or hurt others. If we do have these things as assignments in classrooms, we need to be really thoughtful about following up on things and not being afraid or avoiding it, but using it as a source of connection. Also, changes in physical appearance. So if you notice a child has some pretty extreme weight loss or they're wearing really baggy clothes, that could be an indication of a potential eating disorder. Perhaps they're pushing around their food on their plate. They're not really eating. They're skipping lunch. They're skipping snack. Those are just kind of indicators to you of, let me kind of look into this more. As far as self-harm goes, this is something that I've seen, unfortunately, a lot in schools. Wearing long sleeves on a really hot day is a good indicator of perhaps a child trying to hide some cuts on their arms, right? Or maybe wearing a bunch of bracelets to cover up a wrist. Those are just some things to note and to just check in on, whether with parents or with the child, and just kind of to keep a radar. So let's look at this little cartoon. If a child had a broken arm and you saw him lying on the ground next to the jungle gym, you'd no doubt run over and get them the help they need, right? We need to get you to the hospital ASAP. The trouble with mental illness or mental health struggles is they are often invisible to others. We don't see a person struggling because of that. We don't see the actual person. And we often don't always understand when someone might be in emotional pain. And this is where mindfulness and compassionate listening can come in. So let's talk about reacting versus responding and how important the differentiation between those are. And this is a very benign, silly example, but I think it makes a good point. When a child drops an ice cream cone, for instance, we probably want to rush up to their aid, buy them a new one, tell them everything will be all right, make the problem go away. But let's reframe that. By reacting so quickly, we aren't giving the child the space to be upset that they dropped their ice cream cone and to show some big emotions and to kind of like let that stress out. We're not really acknowledging, that frustration. So with mental health struggles, it's about taking space to listen to the person hurting, honoring that negative emotion by giving them that space, instead of hushing it away, which may be easy because we aren't comfortable sitting in that vulnerability. We need to try to proceed with a more thoughtful approach to respond. And that's not going to look perfect, right? That can be really hard for some of us. But it's important just to try and to be open about the fact that you're trying. It's even okay to say, I really don't know what you need right now, but I'm here for you and I want to have that space for you. And just by a child hearing that can help them feel so much more comfortable with you and to be able to create a stronger connection in that way, even if you don't know really what to say. And along with this, I also want to talk about empathy for ourselves. And I know that I've said to myself whenever I'm not feeling too great, just try and remember a lot of people have it worse, in my own self-talk, just to kind of shrug off that feeling if I'm a bit down or a bit anxious. And I'm really not holding my emotional well-being as high as my physical well-being, because if I was throwing up or if I had broken an ankle, I'd really have no guilt about canceling plans. But a lot of times we don't honor our inner self that same way when it comes to psychological or emotional kind of frustrations. So just try to remember to be kind to ourselves too. And that really brings us to a really important point. And I want to close with this. One of the most important things we can do for the youth we work with is to take care of ourselves and be models of mental health for them, imperfect models of mental health for them, because we can't just hit mental health and be a 10 all the time, right? It ebbs and flows, but just always working towards that, or always trying to perfect it as much as we can and give ourselves grace. We are a critical part of that microsystem for our students. And that's a privilege that we have, and it's also a huge responsibility. So by us being there for ourselves, first and foremost, that's how we can be there for others. And so whether that looks like rest, movement, nature, creation, alone time, connection, whatever nourishment means to you, whatever reflection means to you, we have to make sure that we're filling our own cup before we go and do the work for others. That's it.
For more information about Project ECHO and upcoming ECHOs with the University of Denver, please visit mortgage.du.edu/ECHO or follow us on Twitter at ECHO_DU_MCE. Thanks for watching.